Okay, welcome everyone to semi-finals of UKM IV 2014. And firstly, I'd like to say congratulations to all the teams that made it here. Okay, so opening government we have UTMRA. Opening opposition we have What You Say. Closing government we have Champagne Socialists. And closing opposition we have UTMRA B. So just a few general rules before we start off this debate. I'd like to tell the audience to silence all your headphones and not leave in between speeches. You can leave after a speech and make sure that no one's speaking in front of you. Okay. So now I'd like to invite Jasmine from UTMRA to start off this debate. Here.
It's a very well-known fact that Bashar al-Assad oppresses his people, commits atrocity like the mal-usage of chemical weapons, and their constant crackdowns on the citizens. It's also a well-known fact that despite sanctions, endless negotiations, threats and intervention, there are very little progress for us keeping Bashar al-Assad at bay. This debate about assassination is mainly about when there is a meaningful threat that's extremely powerful, backed by power and influence, whether removing that main cause of threat will lead to the benefits we want or not. In analyzing this, we will look at other alternatives we have, how that alternative has failed, and evaluate Syria post-removal and assassination of Bashar al-Assad and whether this leads to a positive outcome, right? Our models is very simple. Assassination can be done. We think the people that should do it are the Western and Arabic forces, or cooperation between those two forces. So we think that the alternatives have failed. We told you things like negotiations, peace talks, all of those things have failed in the past. Any methods of intervention or any methods of keeping up with regulations or enforcing any form of regulations in a second, any form of regulations with Bashar al-Assad has failed. So we don't see any viable alternative for us to ever reach and approach the people of Syria. Go ahead.
So you're saying that the moderate Syrian opposition groups like the Syrian National Coalition should do this, or like the Jabhat al-Nusra, the ones that have already married with ISIS?
We don't think so. We don't think that it's necessary. We need to empower a certain opposition group right after the assassination of Bashar al-Assad. We think that post the assassination, we're able to evaluate whether or not we want a certain power, a certain structure to rise to power, or whether or not we want intervention to enter into those areas to establish rights first and establish a democratic figure before we're able to move on to the opposition. Under status quo, we're saying that the region of Syria is not only unstable, but it's led by fear and oppression. There are no hopes for any formation of basic rights. There are infighting and ethnic clash. All those things are rampant. So all those things can't be controlled under status quo because any intervention, any developmental aid, any humanitarian aid are impossible to be delivered effectively because there's no engagement from the government led by Bashar al-Assad with the international community, or no form of cooperation, or no ability for the people to receive those aid without the hindrance of Bashar al-Assad. So we say it's easier to stabilize the region with international intervention post removal of Bashar al-Assad. Furthermore, we say that Bashar al-Assad has too much influence and we like to remove that negative rhetoric. The same way in which we remove the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, we're able to reduce the influence that he has, and we contest this first misconception that power vacuum is necessarily a bad thing. Because we say new rebel groups don't come out of power vacuum, they already existed to begin with. Furthermore, comparatively, even in our worst case scenario, we said any new insurgents that could come up from the removal of Bashar al-Assad are currently underarmed and easily contained compared to the large threat that is Bashar al-Assad. So comparatively, post-removal of Bashar al-Assad, we're able to immediately intervene in those conditions and immediately remove and stabilize those regions with any new ethnic clash that could exist. And we say that most of this come out of oppression and fear that existed because of Bashar al-Assad, and post that we're at least able to remove most of those ethnic clashes. Furthermore, no thank you, we tell you that Bashar al-Assad is a government that's rather empowered by doing things that are largely illegal and illegitimate. So we also say that we, on our side, we believe that this makes things easier for the fight against ISIS. We say that Bashar al-Assad is currently standing in between the fight because the West are arming rebel groups in fighting against ISIS, but Bashar al-Assad isn't one aiding the rebel groups in helping them fighting ISIS. Rather, Bashar al-Assad is also still empowering his militants against those rebel groups. So those rebel groups that are able to fight the ISIS, and the only people that the Western government able to reach to fight ISIS are currently being undermined by Bashar al-Assad and the governance that he has. That means things are entering certain regions becomes very hard for this rebel group because Bashar al-Assad is constantly undermining their capability to enter, constantly making it harder for them to intervene and fight harder for them to fight against ISIS. We believe that all those other, so we believe that even though the Western group, secondly, the Western group, even though they want to defeat ISIS within Syria and remove the influence that ISIS have, they are also worried about empowering the government of Bashar al-Assad while doing so. Because we think that what the incentive Bashar al-Assad has is that although he has a minor incentive to stop ISIS, his major incentive is to allow ISIS and the rebel group to naturally take each other out. And we think that this best satisfies Assad's interest. And we think this particular negative interest is particularly harmful to the way in which Bashar al-Assad operate in that particular region and his incentive in mobilizing his military group to enable that particular negative incentive. So we see that one, the influence of ISIS, no thank you, I'm not taking anymore. The influence of ISIS within those regions and the growth of power of ISIS only works towards the favor of Bashar al-Assad, and as long as he's capable to use that. So we think that the only way in which Western forces are able to ever gain any military capability from any military cooperation from Bashar al-Assad is the moment the rebel groups are taken out by ISIS. That's the only time in which Bashar al-Assad will ever extend any cooperation or any help towards the Western forces. And in that situation, we think that's even worse, because at that point in time, the only thing that you're able to do is empower already powerful government and already extremely military capable, very powerful government with no meaningful opposition at that point in time. And we think that's extremely powerful. That's extremely harmful. All right? No, thank you. So what do we say under our side? We say that one, that not only is Bashar al-Assad someone who is oppressive and someone that's extremely bad towards the people in Syria, and there's no way in which we're able to ever change his ways in which he operates, and there's no way to meaningfully take him out without assassinating and removing him from the power and removing his influence, but he also stands in between the very peace that we need to keep from the large threat that is ISIS, especially since Syria is one of the main areas in which ISIS are currently entering and operating in. We need to make sure that we gain the ability to have regional control over this area in which ISIS is able to perpetuate it and gain military advantage over ISIS, as well as not empowering a militant group that is illegitimate, illegal, and oppressive while doing so. We think that's extremely powerful. We say we have made many mistakes in the past in teaming up with people who are teaming up with people who are oppressive and end up becoming our worst enemy at the end of the day. We say that before we're ever able to intervene meaningfully within Syria, we need to remove this particular threat and make sure that Bashar al-Assad is assassinated, we propose.
Thank you, Jasmine. Now I can invite the leader of opposition to start off opposition. Please.
Mr. Speaker, we are going to talk firstly about ISIS. We're going to talk about what they are not doing at all to ensure that you get post Bashar al-Assad, you want to have an ISIS dominated dominance of the country, and what will be a worst outcome for a country. And we'll give you an example of Iraq and Afghanistan as well. But largely our debate was simply about how it's wrong to renege on international obligations of war by assassinating a foreign leader. You should either only attack a country when countries have a direct threat to your own country, or B, you let the locals, whom you can empower directly, but let locals decide their own fate. That is, they don't stand with the opposition, and I think this approach is simply heinous. But firstly, the ISIS. This is important, right? Because not once did they actually discuss the extent and the magnitude of the presence and the power that the ISIS currently has in Syria. Syria may not be the best country in the world, most ideal in terms of the way the government operates, but it's a lot more stable than, or rather, it could be a lot more unstable than otherwise if we had this policy. We take out the only leader out there who's able to keep ISIS at bay. We would say here, the risks that are running, which they have not argued as to why the risk is not important. So you take out the only leader, and an army or rather a government has been able to so far keep the ISIS at bay and prevent from slaughtering furthermore innocent Shiite people in towns in Syria, has been able to keep that at bay and stop them from becoming a lot more radical. So you risk power falling to the hands of the ISIS. This is important because the rebel groups, well, not the ISIS, the rebel groups, are actually losing a lot of power within Syria. They're very weak. They've actually become useless in getting the agenda, and they're losing popularity among the locals. Secondly, the ISIS are not a local rebel group. They're funded by foreign mercenaries. They've got a global appeal because of the radical approach. That means that they're far stronger than the rebels. And this policy of the government doesn't tell us how they're going to reduce the risk of the ISIS getting bigger hold. We will point you the example of Iraq, where you take out an unpopular leader like Saddam Hussein. What do you have is a far worse outcomes. We had rebel groups coming in, slaughtering out more people, and now the claim for the local people on the ground, the Iraqis, is that life was still better when Saddam Hussein than otherwise. People are being killed all the time. Life is generally not the way that people want. So we argue they run the risk of a power vacuum that ISIS might potentially feel, and Syria will be in far worse state than otherwise. Now, secondly, let's look at general principles here. We will argue firstly that this assassinating a foreign leader, because I presume that by Arabic forces, they mean like international Arabic force. I mean, otherwise, I don't know what I mean by assassination. So, international force, without, I guess, Arab people, maybe American Arabs, I don't know, like Arab people, will come in and assassinate this good. Firstly, we will argue that this is morally wrong, rather in our line with international obligation of law, the laws of war. It destroys the principles of international committee and it shows a blatant disregard for the laws of war. Why is that so? Because Bashar al-Assad is not a direct threat to other countries. So wherever these forces come from and the countries that they represent are not in a rightful place to even assassinate a foreign leader. Secondly, war should be conducted by way of militaries being pitted against each other. And even in that case, you only kill the soldiers who are directly shooting at you. That's why, for example, we have things like POWs. If a guy's injured on field and his enemy, you don't like shoot his brains out. You take him in and treat him humanly, and you put him through a due process where he gets trial, and the same should happen with Assad. Capture him if you can and put him through like due process through and that's how you align yourself with international obligations. Why is this important? Because with this policy, you show such an utter disregard for the principles of international committee and the laws of war, making it much harder for anyone out there in the world to have any moral standing when they try to push for countries like Syria to abandon chemical weapons and simply obey other principles of international law. Secondly, we argue, and this is like a further point to what I've been alluding to, that you actually legitimize a return to a disregard to the laws of within the Syrian regime. It's only recently we managed to get Bashar al-Assad to agree to give up the use of chemical weapons. The rest of the weapons he's used before on the Sunnis themselves. You make it easier for the hardliners in the regime to have the arguments gain more credibility that we should not give a damn about what the world generally expects of us. We should not give a damn that we might become like a pariah state like North Korea, because it doesn't give us anything in return, because all we have is a little bit taken out just like that without any due regard for the laws of war. Hence, make it much harder, for moderation to occur within the regime, because the bodies are seen as out of touch with reality, and B, you run the risk that now any rebel groups that try, though weak as they are, try to again cause an uprising against the government. You're going to have a resort to worse methods of warfare that are illegal, and hence you're going to have far more abuses. Okay, they didn't tell us why they're okay with that risk, and why is that this plan result in a definite positive outcome. If they don't, then what the risk is a lot more harm, a lot more instability, and that's simply not right. Look here, okay. My phone's dead. Okay, so thirdly, I'll argue, Mr. Speaker, that on the local front, thank you, bro. Thanks, sweet guy. Okay, on the local front, you're also going to make it harder for the regime in power, whoever the next leader is, to protect citizens against attacks by the ISIS. This is important. The ISIS has already been making a lot of headway into certain towns, and they're funded by foreign donors. They have a global appeal. They're getting stronger day by day. Before that, yes.
Many people are lying here at the West and everyone else, we seem to legitimize the actions of Assad by picking up his enemies as well.
Sorry, could you just repeat that?
Okay. If you take out Assad's enemies and not do anything to him, wouldn't you be seen also as legitimizing his actions?
But you see, it's okay for us to target ISIS because they are a radical group that's a direct threat to the international community, because ISIS existence means that you have harmful action happening in Iraq, they're affecting Western embassies elsewhere, so there's a direct reason why we can attack ISIS. But with regards to Bashar al-Assad, he's not a direct threat to any country in the world, and that's why we are going to have a huge risk there. Secondly, we are, okay, and further, and this ties in nicely with my third argument about the local power vacuum that might result. You're going to have a possibility of an Afghanistan-like regime occurring, i.e. the Taliban regime occurring. But what we have right now is at least a government that pretends to have some respect for international obligations, that pretends to at least try to engage in talks with foreign leaders, and there's some ability for moderates to have any kind of say. With this policy, you're going to make it much easier for hardliners to take over the regime. It may not even be the Shiites, it might be someone from the ISIS front or someone from the Sunni front who manages to take over power. But the risk then is you get a regime that's almost impossible to negotiate with, because you've lost the moral argument that we do care about due process, we do care about international laws, we do care about our general principles of how countries should behave. That's why this policy is far too risky. It does not give us any guarantees of unequal outcomes. It only results in ISIS possibly being more empowered. You're only going to make it harder for any moderation to occur. We clearly have to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Now I'd like to invite the President to present his speech.
What side opening opposition has to understand that you cannot run away from the debate and say, let's not take out Bashar al-Assad, let's just deal with ISIS. Because in Jasmine's speech, she told you that this is like killing two birds with one stone, right? Because the mere fact that the ability for Bashar al-Assad to still maintain a presence in Syria is blocking the ability for every other individual within the Middle Eastern as well as the Western states to enter and combat ISIS. And that's a comparative that we provide in this debate. Therefore, we think that opening opposition as of right now is out of this debate, right? I'll tell you two things in my speech. One, why containment of ISIS is important insofar as we require a fast and quick action like assassination and to break down all the benefits that they never wanted to engage with under their side of the house. Jasmine told you in her speech, one, that ISIS is, as it is losing their stronghold in terms of regarding other Western interventions already. But the difference here in Syria, and they told you that there's no connection to it, right, is that there's no ability for them to come in because they don't want to be seen as legitimizing the actions of an illegitimate state. Comparatively to Iraq, for example, there is a legitimate state, right? Mr. Al-Abadi is asking for Western help for individuals to come in and help. No, thank you. That's a comparison that we provide under our side of the house. They also told you that there's an incentive for Bashar al-Assad to act. We don't think so. And Jasmine brilliantly pointed out in her speech that these are two enemies that Bashar al-Assad has. A, the fact that there are moderate rebel groups that exist, no thank you, in Syria, but also B, ISIS is a threat to him as well. To him, it's like letting two enemies fight each other and take them out, and he does not have to engage in this scenario, right? Therefore, we don't see any incentive whatsoever for Bashar al-Assad to enter, because to him, it's like a two-pronged fight, right? But under our side of the house, at the very least, we aid moderate rebels, because we say it's unfair for you to have to fend off ISIS as well as having to fend off Syrian military. No, thank you. We think that there is a connection there. They told you that you will lose a moral argument as a community, right? We don't think so. A, we don't think that it'll be seen as Western imperialization or whatever, because Jasmine told you in her speech that this can be a collective agreement of decisions between Western states as well as other Middle Eastern states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, all other people that don't like ISIS but don't like Bashar al-Assad as well. But under our side of the house, you also lose the moral argument, because when you enter and you aid in evicting the enemies of Bashar al-Assad, you also lose the moral argument of why do we help individuals that have committed atrocities at the same time saying that you deserve help because and being hypocritical about it. No, thank you. Under our side, we balance out who can we take out in this scenario, right? B, we also think, Mr. Speaker, in order for us to have meaningful interactions with individuals within the Middle Eastern groups, no thank you, we have to remove the ability for one person to be able to wield the amount of rhetoric and influence in order for you to take out the bigger enemy. We also say in this scenario that it's not really just about picking and choosing, but the way in which we have a fast and quick action has a consequence to other groups within society, right? But before I move on, I'll take.
Are you saying it's okay for us to disregard international laws as far as America and Saudi Arabia agree that it's okay to infringe on those same laws?
Okay, in my positive contribution on why containment of ISIS is important and requires fast and quick action, I'll also engage with this like judgment and removing judicial ability to guide people and why it's not enough, right? Firstly, let's look at the comparison of fights Jasmine was talking about. When she told you that the ability for you to enter and engage with ISIS, in contrast, in having to engage with the military within Syria, is a lot different, right? Because you have individuals that are under weaponized, and you need to engage with these individuals. But secondly, it's hard to fight because A, you don't want to enter because you don't want to be seen legitimizing the actions of these individuals. Like we say, we also say that he's a threat because as of right now, right? Bashar al-Assad has made continuous statements and say, I don't really need to engage with this because it's not really my problem because you have two individuals already fighting. Why should I engage? But thirdly, they say we disregard justice. Are you joking? The International Criminal Court is already regarded as a joke because even if you indict an individual, you have no enforcement policy. That means that even if you want to catch him, you can. No, thank you. On a comparative, we need a fast and quick action as opposed to allowing these individuals to go on and run away from the ability to justice, right? We think in this scenario, you can sacrifice some moral judgments in terms of trying to achieve the better good. We say that under our side, under both sides, you still have rhetoric that exists in terms of influences, right? But we think that when you remove one threat that affects every other individual in society, as well as removing the threat of ISIS, this rhetoric can be changed to the way in which the cooperation between the West and the Middle East can also help individuals, as opposed to just the West having vested interests under that side of the house. We say that Syria needs help as well, because when you're talking about towns or cities like Aleppo, Maria, and Raqqa, in that scenario, on a comparative, Iraq was a lot worse, right? We agree with that opening opposition. In this recognizing that Iraq was in a worse off position and we entered a bit too late in order to help in that scenario, this is where we think we have to take fast and active action to ensure that it does not extend into Syria as a whole, as well as other borders within these countries, right? Because they consider in their speech that you have foreign militants that are fighting in the scenario. That means that it's a transnational and a global problem that exists in all spectrums. That means that you cannot leave individuals within Syria to fend off for themselves in order to ensure that one person can stay alive that did not have any benefit to individuals within society. What were the breakdown of benefits that we told you? For example, when you're talking about the Western states, right, and recognizing that there's a threat that is global, the ability for you to enter and create stability within Syria is extremely important. Recognizing that recognizing the ability to enter is also seen as an action that is good for every single individual in society. We think it's a lot easier for you to be able to enter when there's no one person that is holding the influence of rhetoric that I'm a legitimate president, but I don't want to take any action. On the our side of the house, you allow for the Western states to be able to come in and cooperate with other legitimate actors within the Middle East and allow for them to participate in this assassination when you remove this one person. And we don't think that Bashar al-Assad is such a popular figure in the Middle East to begin with because he's a dick, right? And every single other country recognizes that he's a dick, but there's really nothing much that you can do about it. But secondly, we also see, how do we help Syrians necessarily in ISIS? Because we recognize and understand the kind of harms that were inflicted by ISIS onto the Iraqis, for example, or the Kurds in Kuwait. And we recognize that these individuals need help. But what kind of a message do you send to individuals within society when you say that you can fend off for yourself because we think that your governance is limiting the ability for us to take action? Under our side of the house, you allow for the ability for Syrians to move forward and disengage from the problem of having to deal with just Assad as well as ISIS to really focusing to the problem of ISIS at hand, right? We think that when you start arming moderate rebel groups and you start arming individuals in society, the focus of the fight can change to dealing with the larger threat that is ISIS, as opposed to having to deal with Assad's military in the morning and then in the evening go deal with ISIS, right? On a comparative basis, under our side of the house, we take out two enemies in one go. We've proven to you the connection of having Assad as a presence, as well as the ability for ISIS to grow forward if we don't take any action. We think that side opening opposition was unable to deal with this. We are supremely proud to propose.
I'll also close off the opening houses.
I think it became very revealing towards the end of Jay's speech that the only reason they want to assassinate Assad is the false belief that it will make it more convenient for us to deal with IS. And not because we really care about what Assad has been doing. We think this is particularly problematic. But let's provide some more context into the debate, because Assad is not the monster, just the pure monster that they paint him out to be. He's still relatively popular amongst a large cross-section of society, especially in the towns in which he's still control of. But he's still popular amongst the Alawites, the Coptic Christians, even some moderate Sunnis and secularists, business leaders, as well as the middle class. Why? Because within the area in which he controls, life goes on pretty much still as usual. There's some degree of relatively normalcy. People can go to work and to school, and people are happy to live in relative peace because they're sick and tired of war-waging rebel groups who bring anarchy and chaos into the country, who they blame for the volatile economy as well as the prospect of having to face violence. That's why before the rise of foreign Islamic jihadist groups like Al-Nusra Fund, which linked Al-Qaeda, as well as IS mercenaries, the Syrian National Coalition had no traction whatsoever because there's little legitimate support from the average Syrian citizen. And the Free Syrian Army was also fighting a losing battle. So, what's important to recognize is that the Assad regime is an effective bulwark against military attacks from outside. And that's important. That's the reason why people under his control are still grateful and to some extent in support of him. What happens when US intervenes in Arab countries' affairs? And like we say, they cannot just deny that this will stoke anti-Western sentiments and fear of Western imperialism just by saying that we can get other Arab countries to support the US as well. Because to the person on the ground living in Syria under Assad's control, he's not going to give a damn who is allying with the US to come and disrupt his life. He's simply going to hate them more. You simply stoke more sectarianism and hatred and chaos within the country. Never mind the power vacuum that's created that we say would necessarily benefit the strongest fighting units, which are the Islamist groups. We think an American-backed assassination attempt will empower the narratives for the rise of even more nationalist groups as well as extremist elements, such that whichever group takes over within Syria, even if it's not the IS, even if it's some other crony of Assad, is not going to be any more amenable to sort of negotiations and diplomacy and any sort of cooperation that's needed to advance for a greater united Syria, right? By assassinating a popular leader who has been defending a large number of people, you immediately lose the hearts and minds of the people who often blame the US for once again destroying their livelihoods, making it easier for recruitment rhetoric of terrorist organizations, all sorts of other nasty groups. What is our alternative, and why in our alternative are we not actually seen to be supporting Assad? First of all, yes, we are also striking against the IS, but that doesn't mean that we're just weakening Assad's enemies. We are weakening them because they are our enemies. They threaten us. They sort of behead our citizens. We think we don't really need any greater justification to go and deal with them. But on the second level, we're also actively arming and training moderate rebel groups, empowering them. I think we have the same end goals there, right? But the solution then is to make those groups a more effective fighting unit against Bashar al-Assad. That's why we will never be accused of working with him anyway. While at the same time, we can also cooperate with the Kurds to deal with both the IS as well as Assad. So there's no reason, but more importantly, there's no reason why we can't strike against Assad and the IS at the same time. All they claim was, it's inconvenient. We need to save face. It looks somewhat hypocritical. That's not a good reason to assassinate someone, to save your own face, and you're seen as such insanely selfish, you lose trust and a sort of standing of US within the international arena. So why can't we strike against both Assad and why can't we deal with both Assad and IS at the same time? We're already in the same school. We're already having tons of airstrikes against IS. It's not as if we have to report to Assad about what we do within the country or we have to cooperate with him. But more importantly, they never actually told us how taking out Assad empowers us to deal with IS. All they said was Assad is a terrible person. When we get rid of him, things will get better because we can now deal with IS, without giving us any logical reasons why that will actually be the case. My question then is, what is the end goal? The end goal is not just to eliminate people whom we don't like, right? The end goal is is to ensure that we have a peaceful Syria. That's only possible when we empower moderate Sunni rebels to become strong enough to stake a claim for themselves. And we recognize that takes time. But like taking out Assad doesn't deal with the situation, because what's going to happen is that maybe the Syrian regime may not collapse. There might be a replacement to Assad, for example, or okay, that's your extension. Very good. You guys do it, okay? More importantly, right? Once you assassinate Assad, let's assume you do weaken the Syrian regime. It is completely counterproductive on a few levels, right? First of all, because the parties that are best able to take advantage of the fall of Assad are the most powerful rebel groups, which are the Al-Nusra Front and the IS, who are now able to more easily infiltrate and invade into these towns and hence capture more territory, actually making it harder rather than easier for us to combat them, versus right now where they're packed in between moderate rebel forces as well as the Assad regime, for which the IS can't really make inroads into, which makes them more isolated, easier to deal with. More importantly, Assad right now is also best able to protect civilians under his control, and that's important and something that we must ensure continues. Yes, ma'am.
But the West already provides arms and money to these people. Why would they change their position and not cooperate when you help take out one enemy and have them focus on the other?
No, because it's not just about your end goals. What you do and what you try to do and whether you do the right thing to get there also matters. We're helping moderate people stake a claim for their own lives, to defend themselves, to go through their own revolution. We're not taking their powers away from them and imposing something. And then after that, my question is also, what happens after you take out Assad? Because there's no relevant replacement in place that can take over any sort of transitional government, given that the Syrian National Coalition is seen as a joke and has no support both within Syria and outside Syria either. So it's not even as if they're able to guarantee some sort of transition process that ensures that things don't go to shit, right? So we think at the end, like last but not least, you just think the last reason why we win, because we're never able to deal with Ashok's arguments about long-term trust, about long-term US social and political capital. If US continues to intervene on its own, if it continues to take actions such as assassinations without caring about the people on the ground, if they continue losing the hearts and minds of people on the ground within the Arab world, it's just going to make things way harder later on. It's just going to sow the seeds of further discord and hatred between both the groups on the ground as well as toward the US. We see no reason why this is effective or advantageous for US to do so. Very, very proud of this.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now I invite my program to start with closing by
Yeah.
There is no relevant replacement for Assad that will occur. I quote the opening opposition. The model from the opening government will assassinate him. And then this was very revealing, Mr. Speaker, because the entire opening exchange is speculative, based on speculatory outcomes of who's going to step in, when this debate clearly requires some kind of projected roadmap of what could happen. Okay, so yes, the most likely projected outcome, when they want to talk about the strongest person stepping into the breach, don't forget that the strongest person behind Assad are Assad's generals, people who control the tanks, control the guns, control the money, have some degree of support, though crucially, not the same degree of support Assad enjoys amongst his Coptic Christians and his Alawites and so on and so forth. These are the people who will step into the breach. So no, the Free Syrian Army won't win overnight. We think the chances will be improved. That's good. We don't think ISIS will win. We think ISIS is pretty shit at fighting. That's basically my first response on ISIS, and I'm gonna go on to that in a bit. But we think like ultimately, even if ISIS was some reasonable fighting force, so like there's a reason why Syria has been able to hold them at bay. It's because they just aren't meaningfully capable of taking down the Syrian regime, and it won't be even if that regime is decapitated. So that's going to be that has to be relevant here. First, I'm going to go through what outcomes you want and why they're not actually inconsistent with each other. Secondly, I'm going to deal with ISIS and hypocrisy. Next, I'm going to deal with whether they hate the West. Then I'm going to move on to constructive, where I talk about why this particular conception of slightly medieval against justice is entirely morally justified. And next, I'm going to talk about why dynastic politics are bad and how we lead to a better politics and a greater chance of a Syria that's post like whether that leads to revolution or reform. Okay, so what sort of outcomes do you want in this debate? Why are they inconsistent? Firstly, we want to do good, and that's what my first construct is going to cover, about why this is actually a morally good action, something that opening governments have touched on. They're talking about how it's committed war crimes, but maybe didn't analyze in great detail. Next, we want to be able to act against ISIS. So that's my first rebuttal. You know, and why that maybe specific reasons for why we aren't doing enough and why Assad's holding us back. Oh, again, different reasons from what Oji said. Next, lastly, I think most importantly, we want a Syria that moves towards less evil, so no chemical weapons attacks, and perhaps more democratic or at least more stable and more peaceable means. So we think we get that. That's my last contention. First thing, ISIS. Okay, so ISIS is this media myth, really, because what ISIS is really good at is manipulating the media by cutting people's heads off and telling the press that that they've come across the desert, that they're within a certain distance of Baghdad, but they're not actually making military strikes. Because every time they've been tested in open warfare, when they've been tested against people who know how to fight, like the Kurds, like trained militias, as opposed to Iraqi Shias who've run away from them, they've not succeeded. They've lost at Kobani. They've been unable to make any meaningful military strikes in either direction. So ISIS is not a reasonable fighting force. But even if ISIS, was somewhat competent at these basic tactical maneuvers, no thank you. ISIS can't actually aim in at least the short or even the medium term to take over Syria. Why is that so? Because ISIS' very ideology is against the vast majority of Syrian people, the Syrians who are on the side of Free Syrian Army, the Syrians who might be Islamists, but because ISIS has said things like, because you threw a lot of the Jabhat al-Nusra, if we see you on the streets, we're going to chop off your head, because that is the way ISIS works. Because ISIS basically says, if you aren't with us, you're absolutely against us, we're going to chop your heads off. That's why people don't want to back ISIS. So it's not a meaningful long-run goal to say ISIS is going to take over Syria, because they can't. But before I go on, opening.
When ISIS fought almost all the way to Baghdad and Iraq, they took over banks and military compartments. They had F-16 fighter jets and tanks and shit tons of money.
Okay. One. That's a lie. Two, having F-16s and tanks, having F-16 doesn't mean that you have trained pilots who can fly F-16s. Like, if it did, right, presumably they would have air superiority and they'd be doing far more in Syria than they are doing currently. There's a reason why they haven't been able to go beyond that. But beyond that, regardless of whether ISIS is a genuine threat or not, the fact is that Assad remains to have a military advantage, and also it's also true that in the status quo, one of the reasons why we can't fight ISIS effectively is because Assad's holding us back in a few specific ways. Firstly, Assad is deliberately soft on ISIS. Not just because he wants to play the two of them off against each other, but he's deliberately soft on ISIS because having ISIS around allows the West to keep him in power and legitimizes the West to be soft on him. But that's problematic. But more important, so we think that in order to deal best with ISIS, it's best to remove Assad, who is limiting our efforts to do that. That's not really the most important thing. I just don't think ISIS is that relevant in concern. Not going to take over. Next question: will Syria turn against the West? So opening government says maybe they won't, maybe they will. We think even if we get more anti-West and anti-imperialist sentiment in Syria, that's fine. Why must the Middle East love the West? Why is it bad if the Free Syrian Army takes over Syria and decides the West is the evil imperialist empire? Because China probably doesn't think very much of the West. China engages with the West on things that are good for China and probably good for the world, like economics. You don't need to love Western influence and Western oil companies trying to buy the oil contracts in order to be a part of the international community. They're not going to become a pariah state because there are advantages to be interacting with the rest of the world. They're probably just not going to love the US. That's absolutely fine. We don't really care. We don't think that was important. So, okay, one, why is it okay and in fact good for us to act against Assad? It's very simple. Internationally, we've created this norm where there are crimes against humanity, not just crimes against a specific branch of people. So when you do things like use chemical weapons against your people, you're committing a crime not just against the Syrians, but against all of humanity. You're telling people that these people aren't worth living, that these people are allowed to suffer. Therefore, it's legitimate for the West to act, to bring them to justice. In the absence of being able to meaningfully try him before the ICJ and do all these things, the absence of action is condoning this act. Therefore, it's morally legitimate to bring it into place. They say it's against international law. We think legalistic arguments aren't the point here. It's morally allowed to do this. It just doesn't matter that what international law says, because it's okay to break the law to do the right thing. Next question, dynastic politics. So the key here in Syria and the world is that dynastic politics are powerful, and the reason why Assad limits the ability of reformers or revolutionaries to take over. And the reason why people continue to not revolt against Assad's rule despite the crimes committed, because Assad brand continues to be powerful. So everyone knows that he's a dick, yes, but he's a dick who everyone's enthralled to. And everyone's enthralled to this dynasty because his father was really powerful. His father cast himself as some kind of post-colonial savior, like last bastion of pan-Arabism. People buy into that myth. Even the West buys into that myth to some extent because it's Western educated. It doesn't look like a loon like Gaddafi. We put his wife up in his pages of Vogue as some kind of like reformist princess. So we're enthralled to this myth of Assad, and he holds us back. He holds the Syrians back from being able to stand up against him and realize what this guy is really about. When a general takes over, the venal nature of the military becomes obvious. That general is personally in a position of weakness, more likely to negotiate with us perhaps, but also just someone who's less likely to hold that sort of power that Assad has, hold sort of familial connections within clans. That is better for Syria. We're very happy to propose.
Thank you, member of government. Now I'd like to invite member of opposition. Here you go.
Mr. Speaker, before I move on to my speech, I'd just like to beg you to let me through to the final just so I can prove a point to my teammate, the Terence, that I got here with Terence and I didn't need him. Ladies and gentlemen, we on Closing Opposition argue and agree that Assad is a horrible actor, but we would argue that we would rather him than the Islamic State ruling Syria. We will show you exactly how the Islamic State, as a matter of fact, will take over since they've already made all those gains in Iraq, Iraqi army, which the United States helped train and arm. We don't want to kill him. We want to put him through a court process whenever that comes in the distant future, because we want to break this culture of violence and essentially stop the repeat of what happened in Libya after we assassinated Gaddafi. We also think that assassinating Assad will endanger Western troops as well as Western forces, as well as making moderate groups illegitimate leaders of Syria in the future, because they'll be seen as puppets of the West, and any Syrian government that cooperates with the West will never be legitimate. Before that, let's just take a look at the government bench today's debate. On opening government, they couldn't even decide who should do this, ladies and gentlemen. A bit hard in a policy debate where we have to argue like consequences, right? We can't tell, ladies and gentlemen, who's going to do this. But even then, right, they never told you, or they assumed that without Assad, suddenly it's going to be easier to fight the IS. Hang on a minute. Who is it going to be easier for? The US Congress, as well as the Westminster Parliament, have already said we don't want to send troops. It was already hard enough for us to send fighter jets to Syria. No one wants to send troops on the ground and put boots on the ground to fight the war. Who else? And Assad is the only one in that region willing to put boots on the ground and dedicate that fight to ISIS. On closing government, we had a blatant disregard for reality, telling us that Islamic State could never win, as well as Assad is being soft on an enemy that wants to overthrow him, ladies and gentlemen. So 3 points of rebuttal. First, it's necessary for us to assassinate Assad. Not really. Assad has shown trends towards moderation, ladies and gentlemen. After he used chemical weapons and after he was indicted by the ICC, he never did it again. Like, okay, fine, he's still fighting the war, but there's some sort of panic, right, ensuing within Assad. Obama said, we draw the red line. If you do it again, we'll invade. That threat is very real to Assad. And the fact that he hasn't used chemical weapons or like shot at blazing civilians shows that there's something the West is doing that can moderate him. Secondly, a lot of the resources that Assad is using right now is focused towards IS because of the bigger threat. Because even Assad knows that some of the rebel groups in the Syrian opposition are also trying to fight the IS. So they're not doing as much damage to the rebel groups as they would like to ascertain. Secondly, they told us the war will be easier to fight and it's worse off if Assad is still there. First, if you assassinate Assad, as I said earlier, he's the only one who's controlling the army. Obviously, he's telling the generals and commanders, don't use chemical weapons, don't commit war crimes, otherwise we're screwed. But if you kill him, there is no incentive for the troops on the ground or the little lieutenants in like the little, Damascus and elite posts to follow international codes of conduct anymore. It is likely more war crimes will occur. It is likely whatever stockpile of chemical weapons they have left will be used on civilians as well as opposition groups. You remove that figurehead, you remove that accountability. Secondly, if you remove Assad, we think it's likely that other members of the Alawite bureaucracy will take over. He's not like a Kim Jong-il who we revere and the whole army listens to him. If he's gone, someone else from the Alawite elite, like someone as bad as General Yassin, might take over and might be even worse, ladies and gentlemen. Third, now you start a war against the West, because if the West is assassinating him, ladies and gentlemen, you're empowering the exact rhetoric that the Islamic State is using, that the West are enemies and the West do not respect Central Arabic governance. We think, ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to swing a lot of the moderate groups towards IS, because essentially the United States is intervening when it was already hard for them to start in the first place. Fourth, this part about being soft on IS. IS wants to overthrow Assad, so do the rebel groups. He wants to fight them as well, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, IS can't win, as asserted from Closing Gov. 3 reasons why they can. First, even the Iraq army couldn't contain them from taking over oil fields in Mosul. The Iraq army was trained and armed by the US Army, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, they have already more than 20,000 members within ISIS, almost overpowering the numbers that the rebel groups have, and more flying in from France and Malaysia and Indonesia and the United Kingdom each day. They have a global network of supporters. You know, they're like literally like funds from Malaysia and from Indonesia funding them, ladies and gentlemen. This is like Al-Qaeda, like times 10, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that there's any possibility that they could not win. So first about IS, we tell you they will win. Why? First, we tell you Assad is the best defense, right? Because he has command over a national military network. Unlike the rebel groups who are scattered and commit sporadic assaults on certain areas, Assad has like a broad board where he can essentially see where IS are attacking from and mobilize troops in that order. So if, for example, we want, like, and secondly, he's the only one willing to commit troops on the ground. We don't think the Congress or the Parliament in the United Kingdom is going to be ready to send troops to Syria, even if it's convenient for them to do so. And we see also that Assad is like kind of having like a secret, subtle cooperation with the West, because Assad's not attacking American or French fighter jets flying into the area or American drones like running surveillance over Syria, right? So obviously he's like formed some sort of like broad, like subtle partnership with the West, so we don't think necessarily he's necessarily an enemy. Also, given that he has more protection over the oil fields in Syria, it's very important we have him on our side. No, thank you. Secondly, IS will come in and attack moderate groups in Syria. Currently, Assad is drawing IS resources away from fighting the moderate groups like the Free Syrian Army, like the Syrian National Coalition. If we remove Assad, that means Islamic State comes in, tells all the extreme groups, join us, tells all the moderate groups, join us or die, and IS essentially will overrun Syria. We think it's likely that they're going to do this as well. Lastly, we think the communities in Syria are going to be worse off without Assad. Even if Assad has committed atrocities, he's the only defense the Shiite community, the Coptic Christians, and women in Syria have. He didn't kill women. He didn't force them out of his boundaries. Yes?
Why is an allied general going to be worse at fighting IS and worse at protecting these minorities than Assad?
Well, we know that Assad is not bad. We don't want to take the risk of someone we don't know rather than someone who's proven that he can do it. So, like I said, the Shiite community is going to be like literally wiped out as they were in Iraq. We think that's worse off. Second, post-war reconciliation. First, we tell you it's important to eliminate the culture of violence that exists. As of now, the moderate groups like the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Coalition are major players within the opposition. If they take over, they're likely to put Assad through a court process. They believe in democracy. They believe in fair process. If we assassinate Assad, we essentially like embedding this culture of violence where if you don't like the leader, you shoot him or you rebel against him or you kill him rather than using due process. Thirdly, it's likely to demonize moderate groups in Syria, because if the moderate group does it, they're going to be seen as puppets of the West. Yes, they already received some funding from the West, but that's like a big difference compared to like actively assassinating Assad. Now, any government, any moderate group that wants to come to power is going to be seen as a puppet and won't have any sort of independence from the West. Lastly, as well, we need Assad to say his piece. We need him to testify in court and tell us exactly why he committed these atrocities. Otherwise, that rhetoric is hijacked by Islamic groups who will say that this is a Shiite-Sunni conflict, that governance is bad in and of itself. The same thing that happened in Libya, more and more groups are going to try and hijack the rhetoric. More and more groups are going to say why governance is bad, and that's going to be even worse for post-war Syria. We're happy to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition. Now I invite government with to close off government plan.
3 issues face the House. First, which side makes for a more stable Syria? Second, which side creates stronger international conventions? And lastly, IS, which I'll talk about a little because closing part was important. So first, which side makes for a more stable Syria? Now, opening opposition told us that Assad is popular in Syria with certain groups of people. We think this is imprecise. Like, we don't think he's popular across the board. He's popular with particular factions who pledge allegiance to him, whom he's been personally good to. Yi-Arn told you this popularity is a bad thing because it entrenches dynastic politics within Syria. We didn't hear much of a response from closing opposition, a bit late for the whip speaker to do this. So let's explain this a bit further. What is the legacy which Assad currently has and will pass on to his successor should he be allowed to appoint one? We think it's a legacy which begins with his father, a father who rose to power on a wave of popularity. Popularity because he painted himself as the post-colonial pan-Arab strongman. This is the sort of power which empowered him to make decisions like committing the Hama massacre, the sort of brutal, violent tactics which he used to keep Syria under his arm. This is a sort of legacy which Assad continues to have. The mystique which surrounds him as an individual, which Yi-Arn has told you is carried on in the West by the way we portray his wife as some sort of, like, you know, as in the media, by the way we portray him as an individual as being central to the Syrian story. The fundamental problem is this. With this mystique and this narrative surrounding Assad, it is difficult for rebel groups in the Syrian population, to rebel against him or to form strong opposition blocks to his power. Furthermore, we think, in contrast, a future leader who is not Assad will be fully aware that he is not similarly well insulated against this sort of opposition. This means, even if it's not an outright revolution that happens, future leaders are likely to be more cautious in the way they make decisions, and less likely to use their historical narrative to justify acts of brutal violence. So we ultimately make for a far more stable Syria. Some small challenges came up from closing opposition. First, they said it's not feasible for us to do this because we've already had general opposition to strikes. I want to point out that same argument will apply to the alternative of extracting Assad. But fundamentally, there's a reason why assassination is a far better option than an alternative. Because assassination is relatively much simpler than either a full-scale invasion or even an extraction operation. You just need a crack team of snipers to enter a nation and shoot him apart. Maybe you could send a drone to do it, right? So the problem is, comparatively, an extraction operation is far more difficult. You have to get past his layers of armed guards, and you have to go all the way to the center of Syrian territory, take the man from his own palace, and then bring him out in presumably a helicopter lift, passing through acres and acres of Syrian airspace so you could get shot down. No, thank you. So on all these counts, we think it's far more likely that our policy can manifest. This means if you do care about justice, which we'll get to in a while, our policy is the one which you should definitely vote for. No, thank you. So our side makes for a much more stable Syria in the long run. We think the generals who continue Assad's regime will not be as well insulated. We break dynastic politics. No, thank you. Second question, which side creates stronger international conventions? Now, early in this debate, we heard from opening opposition, we will lose Western popularity. All right, so Yi-Arn already pointed out, Western popularity, no thank you, is hardly the metric for this debate. Why do we care about the West being popular? The response coming from closing opposition was, we care because if you lose popularity for the West, then we will have more popularity for ISIS. I'm not quite sure why that follows, guys. So thank you, both of you. It doesn't mean that just because you don't like the West, you will like ISIS more. ISIS represents a very specific, and a very radical interpretation of Islamic theology. It's not like everyone's just going to buy into it just because they like the West a bit less. No, thank you. But furthermore, we've told you that it's not like you're going to lose massive amounts of Western popularity, even if, because we said in Yi-Arn's speech, Assad is popular with a specific subset of the Syrian people, not all Syrian people, and certainly not all Arab people. No, thank you. We think there's general dislike for Assad across the board. But the most important argument, we heard from opening opposition, this was extended in closing, that we lose the moral argument that we care about due process. We are going to lose one of two moral arguments. We either lose the moral argument that we care about due process and about the minutiae of international law, or we lose the moral argument that heads of state should not turn their weapons on their own people, or we lose the moral argument that people should not fire chemical weapons at his own people. No, thank you, both of you. Which moral argument is more important, and which is a better international convention for us to enshrine? The moral argument that we should stand by minutiae that hamper us in our ability to discharge justice, or the moral argument that people should not be allowed to kill innocents with their tanks and with their monopoly on violence? Closing.
So right now, moderate groups like the Syrian National Coalition support democratic process, rule of law, and justice. If we kill Assad and we empower the rhetoric that violence is the only way to go, how is that a stable post-war?
Thank you, sir. I was just about to deal with that, so let's deal with it right now. We heard from the entire opposition bench, more or less, that this will cause rebel groups or even for generals who replace Assad to revert to a situation of illegality. I'm going to suggest if we kill Assad, future leaders will probably think twice before committing the same actions which Assad himself did. So there's a great reason to believe our policy works for the extent it's influence for these people as well. That's why it's important to establish this international convention. The convention which says, no matter who you are, you probably shouldn't be doing terrible things, because now we've demonstrated that the international community is willing to discharge justice, no thank you, for the people of your country. So if you claim that future leaders will revert to illegality, this makes no sense. Finally, they told us again in closing that Assad isn't so bad, right? Because he's been after he committed some terrible things, he's been doing a bit less of them. But first, I'm going to point out, like, doing less terrible things does not obviate your moral responsibility for having done terrible things in the past. That's like saying, oh, the murderer committed 1 murder, he committed 10 murders, and he stopped for a period of 10 years. I guess that means he's no longer morally culpable. But besides, Assad has not been entirely upfront on this, right? Like, he's been employing stalling tactics against Western nations. So thank you, both of you, for attempting to check on his chemical weapons inventory. So on all these counts, our side establishes far stronger international conventions. Finally, ISIS. Thank you. So, Yi-Arn told you that ISIS is bad at fighting, and furthermore, this is important. Even if they were good at fighting, it is unlikely they will make massive land grabs in Syria because their ideology is in general opposition to the Syrian people. You cannot rule a country just with a small band of people with guns. You do need some amount of popular support. But they told us in closing opposition this is untrue. They gave us some facts about how strong ISIS is and how badly the Iraqi army handled this. Yes, but A, that's because the Iraqi army is itself not a very fully functional military. Second, because the Iraqi army tends to care about Shia-dominated areas. So when ISIS was attacking Sunni-dominated areas, yeah, they were less likely willing to intervene. It was only later when the threat became apparent to their own communities that they put up resistance. Yi-Arn also told you that the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters actually, like, for a small band of poorly trained militiamen, they're doing a pretty good job holding up ISIS. But finally, they said we need Assad specifically because Assad is the one who controls the military and everything else. But why do we need Assad to do that? Like, any general who follows up from Assad will be capable of doing the same thing. We heard from closing up because we know for certain that Assad is a great leader, who chemical attacks his people, and we don't know for certain that any future general will be as good. Okay, guys, balance of probability, right? A general in an army fighting for Assad, probably decently skillful, probably has a band of advisors who can help him make decisions. We're not sure why a single individual, that particular man, is so important for making these sorts of military decisions. It is our side that makes for a more stable Syria, that creates stronger international tensions and shuts down IS.
Thank you, Government Whip. Now I'd like to invite Opposition Whip to close out this debate. Here. Woo! We love you.
Mr. Chair, this debate is not about what Syria wants, but this debate is about what Syria deserves. And when it comes to the bigger existential threat, we believe that putting a bulwark in the middle of this war is something that's much more important. Let's look where this debate actually gone through and what are the questions I will answer. Firstly, I'll question what happens when Assad is dead and see what is the result here. The closing government mates spoke about how the debate has become speculative, but they even had more speculations on their side. Second argument was about what happens to dynastic politics. It will show to you how it's less likely to have dynastic politics at the end of the day, because what will happen under our side later would show there would be some form of change. But thirdly is the idea of due process versus assassination. It will show you why this due process is better in the long run on our side. Firstly, what happens when ISIS is dead? The first thing that would happen is the question is that, will this empower, when Assad is dead, will this empower ISIS in general? We say yes, because the main reason they decided to ignore from Rafiq's speech is that how Assad alone is the only reason why the military has any semblance of structure. Because now, in this process, when Assad is practically controlling the military, he is the one who has the overarching narrative when it comes to all of the other generals and all of the other bodies. There is no other person below him who can replace him, who can be in his place, because his two sons, Hafiz and Karim, would learn how to masturbate first before even take over the military, because they're that young in general. So what happens here is that you have all of these many little Napoleons who try to take over the military and become overtly paranoid. What I also have to understand, Assad is the guy who told the generals to stop using the chemical weapons and use them against the ground. Now the fact they become very isolated and even more paranoid because they think that they have to fend off themselves amongst all of the other FSA groups on the ground right now. They are more likely to use force against the dissidents on the ground. So what happens here? There will be more violence on the ground in general. In fact, it becomes even worse because we don't know why exactly these generals are somehow still siding Assad. Is it because of the internal benefits he get? So the question then becomes, where all of these generals would align themselves at the end of the day? Would they align with ISIS in the future because they might change the perception, because they're probably not just Shiites? That becomes even worse because now all the chemical weapons that they already have in the first place will go to ISIS and they will kill more people under the isolationist policy in general. Now, not only that, because there are many FSA members who might perceive that the smaller little Napoleons might be overwhelmed by ISIS in general, that means there would also be huge number of people within the FSA, or probably even Jabhat al-Nusra would go to ISIS, and that becomes recruitment capital for ISIS in general. Now, second question under this clash is about why is it Assad has an incentive to actually fight against ISIS in general? Because firstly, well, he wants to stay in power. He wants to continue to do so. That means he'll put the extra effort in order to stay within that region. Second of all, and this is something they decided conveniently not to tackle, is that Assad is a Shiite minority, and he has an incentive to actually protect within it. Under his regime, at least he is able to negotiate with whatever Sunni groups that may try to rise up in the future. But what you have to that's why Assad will actively attack against the Sunni ISIS, basically because he knows he can never negotiate with them when somehow they become overwhelming within the region. But thirdly, the greatest proof that ISIS is actually doing something is the very fact that they are at the border, fending all of them off, and somehow that is the reason why the FSA is able to go up to northern Syria in general, because he decided to actually push most of his resources over there. So the conclusion here is simple, is that firstly, we are not sure who might take over because Hafiz and Karim are too young to take over when it comes to dynastic politics. Number two, we don't know what are the reactions of the generals on the ground there, and in fact, we know that they've become even much more paranoid because they are the ones who are much more willing to use those weapons on the ground since no one is holding them back. And the third proof is that Assad himself is a Shiite who wants to protect his own community. That is already a great incentive to not get ISIS to overwhelm his country. But before I move on, yes, closing.
So we told you that the likely successor was the Alfred general who was similar in many respects to Assad, among control in terms of sect and things like that. You can get thrust of our case, which is that a key difference making us
okay, look, there's a contradiction in your case because at first he said that somehow he's a bureaucratic leader who is not part of the military, but he's the one who has the overarching arm throughout the whole this. So the person who might replace him in the future may not be a person from that Shiite community because you at the same time he wants to preserve that political dynasty within his sphere. So when there is no one to replace him within that Shiite community in the first place. That's where all of these other Napoleons might try to fight that power vacuum, and somehow worse comes to worse, they become their own little Napoleons. So the fact that Alawite generals might take over wouldn't be the scenario. Now here's the third part to that clash is that what happens after Assad is dead and somehow the person who assassinates takes over the situation is that firstly, all of that can become recruitment capital for ISIS, something they also didn't tackle, because when they assassinate these groups, most probably when the groups that assassinate Assad, then most probably that group will be in power. The perception that ISIS can use is that these people on the ground, the people on the ground will perceive those in power will be Western puppets whose strings are being controlled by the West. What happens here is that ISIS has even more incentive to pull people on the ground. And the very fact that people on the ground, like probably FSA, perceive that the West has not been doing much for them, that's why they are less likely to actually participate within governance, but they're more likely to participate with ISIS instead. But here's the second part, is that which one actually fuels dynastic politics? Because the very fact that when you prolong the war under your side, when ISIS becomes longer, that's where Hafiz and Karim might possibly be the ones to replace him. In fact, you are the ones who entrenched the idea. At least on our side, when in the future somehow the other groups that are being supported by the United States to actually take over and put him in the ICC, Hafiz and Karim are less likely to get into power because the person who is handing down the throne in the future is practically not Bashar al-Assad, but Hafiz and Karim has to go through proper democratic process in order to get power in the first place. So on our side, when we push it to the ICC, then it's less likely to somehow less likely for these people to actually rise up. But on your side, because the replacement model is so simple because you are just killing another person to get the throne. That's where you are more likely to get dynastic politics, just like how Gaddafi controlled Libya for such a long time. But at the end of the day, due process versus assassination. Who creates a culture of coup d'etat? If you were born during the Syrian conflict, during the Syrian civil war, and that is your only exposure on how you can control the country, then assassination is the only way you know how to express yourselves. We've seen this all throughout all many civil wars where people who assassinate becomes the leader, and that continues. We don't want to have that culture. We want to protect Syria.